Another security consideration we need to make is for account policies, which is why it's on our Security Plus exam and why we're going to talk about it starting right now.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
Welcome back to Security Plus here at IT Pro TV, and today we are going to discuss a wonderful little topic about account policies. We've looked at all sorts of different types of policies up to this point, but the accounts, they have their own policies, and we need to be aware of what they are and how we can work with them to make sure we work in a secure environment. And Wes, you're going to help us with that, as you often do, as we do this little dance we do every day, and we do appreciate your time. But where do we begin when it comes to account policies and the settings therein?
Sure. So now what we're talking about when we talk about policies, we talked about password policies defining the attributes of how you construct your passwords, right? Now what we're talking about, you've got a user account. What kind of policies can you apply to the user account in general themselves? And that's really what we're going to be diving into. And I have to say also, too, that if you're in an Active Directory environment, you could see that you can also apply account policies to machines as well. So let's dive in, right? When we talk about account policies, it's really nothing more than a set of configuration parameters, right? And they define a lot of different things. For instance, we can define them on user accounts. We can define them on machines likewise. Because remember, especially when you're talking about Active Directory, you have what are known as domain members. And when they become a domain member, again, a domain member can be a user. Now they're going to have to abide, if you will, by the configuration parameters defined by the administrator. But remember, what do they log into? Well, they log into workstations, right? And those workstations are also domain members. So that's considered an account as well. So I do mention that computer accounts are also something that we have to keep in mind too, that we can define those configuration parameters also for machines as well. So keep that in mind, user accounts as well as computer accounts too.
All right, Wes, help me out here, because a lot of times you hear account policies and you think, okay, I get that. You've kind of laid that out for us there. But also we see that kind of in conjunction with the idea of access policies. How do the two work together?
Sure. So when we talk about access policies, I think it's important, I should say, to define that what we're talking about access policies now is we're really talking about attributes of the account themselves. Because if you're talking about access policies when it comes to the network, what we can do is we can really stand up an entire server and say, all right, well, users have to be using dial-up or can't be using dial-up, or they have to use a VPN server, or they have certain time of day restrictions. And what we're really talking about here are the user accounts themselves when we talk about these access policies. And it can be based on things like network location. And what I mean by that is, are you allowed to remote in from maybe home, right? We do that here where we are working from home and we need to get back into the network, but are we going to allow that user to do that? All right. Are we going to, we can do it by time-based, right? We can say through things like not only time-based, but like time of day restrictions, right? So different, if you think about the time-based attribute here on an access policy, I can say, well, when you log into this session, you can only be logged in for 10 minutes, or you can only be logged in for a half hour. Let's say in combination with a network location. Sure, you can remote access in, but if your session becomes idle, it's going to disconnect you after 15 minutes. Or, you know what? We don't really need anybody or want anybody to log in on the weekends, right? So there's two considerations there when we say time-based. We can do things by IP address, right? We can say, okay, you're gonna log in. Well, on your user account, what we're gonna do is say you can only dial in, if you will, or log in from this IP address, right? We can base it on things like subnet as well. All right, now I will tell you, Dan, that's interesting because they talk about a couple of things, and really when we talk about network location, that kind of runs hand in hand with the concept of geolocation. Now, geolocation is really just identifying whether users can log in based on where they are currently located. So this is something that's important to understand, and it's also important to understand from the concept of something known as a risky login. All right, now let me tell you what I mean by that. All right. So we identified, and I put this person roughly in Florida because that's where we are here, right? So let's say Dan at 2 a.m. logs in, not 2 a.m., I'm sorry. Let's say,
man, I'm working
really
late.
working hard.
Yeah.
He's a company man. But let's say normal people hours, 7 to 8 a.m. he logs in, right? So we see that, and we're doing auditing on that, right? We're keeping track of the fact that Dan logged in at 7 or 8 a.m. But let's say all of a sudden, there's a log. He logs out. Let's say for whatever reason, he's got to take lunch or something, and then he logs in from, let's say, China. Same account. That's called a risky login. And what the point is, it doesn't have to be that dispersed all the way across the world, but the travel time within those 4 hours between where he logged in initially and where we're seeing the login now, something's wrong there, right? If I know that Dan, there's no way in heck that Dan can get out to California in 2 hours. All right. Do you own a Concorde? I think they're pretty much
No, sold mine.
Sold your
years
Concorde?
ago,
Okay.
yeah,
So just had to make sure because maybe he did. But you see, there's no way he can make it all the way to that location and then log back in. So geolocation is important, especially when you're doing things like identifying those risky logins. So if you've never heard of that term, just be aware of that too. So it's part of account management, and it's something that you need to be aware of.
This makes me think of the idea of geofencing as well, right? The idea where you're going to kind of fence off where you are allowed and disallowed from accessing from. Right?
Absolutely. And you know what? And it's gotten so sophisticated today that they can actually base what resources you can access based on your location as well,
Man,
right?
It's getting granular.
Oh, it's really granular. It's come a long way. So let's take a scenario right here, right? We've got a main office and a branch office, right? In the main office, it's the main network, right? We allow people to connect across the internet from a branch office. Right, we know where they're located, but if we see them trying to come in from any other location, I put the coffee shop here, right? They're not going to be allowed in. But the geofencing is not just the location-based login; it's also the way geofencing. You think about a fence, right? I could say if you're inside of the fence, you gain access to this resource. Maybe if you're the branch office, yeah, you can have access to this application. But again, if you're in the coffee shop, we're seeing where you're coming from. We've got those boundaries put on you. You're not allowed to see those resources. I'll tell you where in the wild, if you will, out there in the really real world. If you think, you know what, Wes, I've never actually seen geofencing. Yes, you have. Advertisements. Advertisements use geofencing behind the scenes, and you're not even aware of it.
Netflix is geofencing the mess out of you, right? If you're not in this region, you don't get access to these shows, right?
Yes, and give you a classic example of that, Dan. So a few years back, I got the privilege of going over to Sydney in Australia, right? And it was interesting. I did exactly that. I launched up Netflix, and I'm like, wait a second, I know this series is here. I was watching it on the plane on the way over here. but you get to Australia and it wasn't available.
You know, it brings up a really good and interesting point is how do people circumvent that kind of restriction? They use things like VPNs.
Yes.
Now, most organizations will probably also implement their own VPN. So when you're in that coffee shop, your geofencing might work. Right. But if you implement the company's VPN, you're now saying, well, I've increased the security and therefore now I can have more access because it's not just me going through their Wi-Fi or whatever. I have a secured tunnel built between myself, even though I'm at an odd location.
And it's not just any VPN either, right?
Right.
You know,
it's
if your
there.
exit point isn't coming from what is sanctioned and agreed on, like Shadow IT.
Right.
You implemented it, but that VPN's exit point is still in, like, let's say Canada, and we're in Florida. Well, wait a second. That's a VPN connection, but that's not our authorized VPN connection, too. So great, scenario there as well. Last thing I want, and again, these are just kind of a couple of outliers, Dan, is this term geotagging. Now, geotagging, you have probably seen this before, and it can be a security vulnerability. Have you ever gone to a place, maybe logged into an application and said, yeah, I just logged into Westside Park here, or in this case, the mall? Right? It's just attaching that location-based metadata to wherever it is, essentially, that you're logging in from. And you've, like I said, you've probably seen this before. So just understand the concept of geolocation, right? We can give or grant you access based on where you are currently located. We can geofence you. Where you are currently located can dictate which resources you get access to or don't get access to, as well as geotagging, and that's, again, just attaching location-based metadata to whatever activity or action that you're performing.
All right, really cool stuff when it comes to account policies. Obviously, some really neat things you can do with them. That being said, Wes, could you maybe even show us or give us an example of what some of these account policies might look like in the real world?
Oh, I would absolutely love to. That's the great part about, here at IT Pro TV. We want to actually show you some of the stuff. So I basically have logged into the same 2019 Windows server that we were logged in for other account management episodes. And what I'm going to do this this time is I'm going to go ahead and let me just increase your view here a little bit, make it a little easier to see. I'm going to go ahead and choose Tools, and then we're going to go to Active Directory Users and Computers. And inside of Active Directory Users and Computers, we're looking at the users container, and I've actually got an account created for myself here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to right-click on the user account, and I'm going to choose properties here. When I choose properties here, you can see that there's a number of attributes here that we can kind of enforce, where you can log in from. Like, for instance, the dial-in tab. Do I want to allow network access, or do I want to control this directly through the network policy server? And this is what I told you. It can be an attribute of the user account, or if you talk to somebody that stood up the network policy server, all of it's controlled in a centralized location. And I have to tell you, that's more common that you're going to see that in a centralized location than on a user-by-user basis. Because remember, centralized administration is the way to go. Assigning static IP addresses, right? I told you that we could do this based on where you're located, more specifically the IP address. Remember, we talked about time of day, not so much time, or not time of day, time-based, excuse me, right? I can say, how long can the active session be? All right, what's the limit? All right, can you be connected in, let's say, from an IP address for how many hours? A whole day? Right? Do I want to disconnect your session if you're idle? Right? I don't want you to just have a connection from a remote location into my network, which would leave me open to some kind of vulnerability. There's a couple other things, Dan, that I just want to put in here and make sure that we address as well. If I go to the account tab here, you'll see that there are login hours. I can set time of day restriction right here. So I can say, you know what? I don't want to let, let's say, anybody log in on Sunday. So I can select Sunday and I can say logins denied. Maybe I don't want I don't want somebody logging in on over the weekend, right? I could set that. Now, in fairness, we'd probably set this in a group policy, and if we wanted it to apply to 100 users, or 1,000 users, we're not going to do it on a user-by-user basis, but the settings essentially would be the same. You would find it inside of the group policy. The other thing, too, is if people do too many, you have what's known as a lockout threshold, and if you've tried to log in and you've typed your password wrong too many times, you will get locked out, and a lot of times what happens is it'll log out until an administrator unlocks it. So you can, the disablement part here, you can actually re-enable, if you will, it right here. If you want, you can have a duration, like for contractors within your network, saying, hey, this account is good for this time, but after this time, it completely expires. So I definitely want you to be aware of that. And one final thing, since I mentioned it, inside a group policy, remember one of the things that I told you that you could do is that you could do this for user accounts, but you could also do this for your group, your computer accounts. And it looks like that's a pop under, not a pop over.
Really helpful.
That's right. So if we look here, I'm just going to right click on the default domain policy and I'm going to choose edit. And I want you to see that we could do account management. We could have set account policies and configure the computers as well as the user configuration likewise too. So this gives you kind of an idea of where you would see this if you were implementing it inside of a live environment. So keep that in mind, that these are some of the attributes and some of the configurations you can do surrounding your account policies.
That's awesome. It really helps us kind of solidify and give some context to these theories and concepts that we've been working our way through when it comes to account policy. So that's great stuff. Well, Wes, it looks like we've come to the end of yet another amazing episode at IT Pro TV. Hopefully you guys have thought so. Anyway, guess what? More to come in our Security Plus series. So we really wish to see you there. As of that day, though, we're going to go ahead and put a pin in it. Call it a day. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.